Can you click it? Hi, good evening. I'm Mary Ann Naif, and I'm chair of the Resiliency Committee. And can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. I'd like to welcome you tonight. I think many of the same people here 6 months ago or so when we started the project with Will, and we now have the draft report of the analysis and the proposed options what to do in case of sea level rise. I'll start off first, though, with just a little background. Maine Won't Wait is the government organization that Harpswell is part of, and because of that, and being a partner, a community resilience partner, it allows us to apply for certain funding, and it basically is the reason we've been able to have these studies done. And basically, it came up, the infrastructure plan came up, they're looking for more thinking about long-term resilience in our planning and not just taking care of the emergencies that are happening. And if they are an emergency, when we go to build back, to kind of plan for the future a little bit. Of course, a lot of that is funding available. Just really quickly, in the climate update last year, after 2 years, they updated the plan to concentrate more on coastal hazards, marine ecosystems, and how that's affecting the worker waterfront communities, which is helpful to our town because we are all of those things. Well, this particular grant is through the Maine Infrastructure Adaptation Fund out of Maine DOT. And last year, the governor put more money into this particular fund to allow the type of studies that we're doing now to be included. We were able to get a $50,000 grant from them to handle this project. Well, so at this point, I think we're ready for the nitty-gritty, and I'll turn it over to Will Haskell of Goral Palmer, who will give you the details of what they found out. Oh, one quick thing. This meeting is being live streamed on YouTube, and if anybody has questions during the talk, we're going to take them at the end. And if you are on YouTube, just put them in the chat, and we'll take care of them that way. And then Ms. Cove is going to move the microphone around when we take questions from anybody in the audience. Okay.
Thanks, Marianne. Welcome, everybody. My name's Will Haskell. I'm a professional engineer with Goral Palmer, and we're based in South Portland. We've been working on a number of these types of studies and roads with the town of Harpswell for a few years now, I guess. The first one that we worked on was actually Basin Point Road, where the little pond is there at the head of the Cove. We recently, at the end of last year, finished up the study for Abner Point Road and Bethel Point Road at Hen Cove. And this project here is a similar study to that, except we're looking at Lowell's Cove and also, what's the other one we're looking at?
Dingley.
Dingley Island. Sorry about that. I'm just going to back up a step and just mention something else here about the Maine Infrastructure Adaptation Fund. So the grant that the town received here is actually a planning grant. This grant actually has a construction component to it as well that has a significant amount more money available. I can't remember if it's $2 million or $4 million, but if the town ever did decide to proceed with some of our recommendations for any of these roads, this grant would actually be a good option for that because it's a significant, amount more than what the planning grant is. So a good opportunity for doing future infrastructure improvements through the Maine DOT. So on these two roads, we were back before everybody, or back before the town, back in June. Our first public meeting was also kind of a kickoff meeting for the project. And so what we're looking at here is we're looking at options for dealing with both of these roads are quite low in elevation, and they flood out with sea level rise and with storm surge. In particular, back in the January 2024 storms on the 10th and 13th, Dingley Island Causeway was overtopped in that storm. The section of Lowell Cove, so there's a couple different sections of Lowell's Cove that we started out looking at one, and then we were told to adjust to a different location. I'll get to a map here in a minute. But the section that we're looking at, I don't believe overtopped in the January storms, but it's right on that kind of slippery slope or that edge of being overtopped with some of the sea level rise and the storm surge that we're seeing. So anyway, the goal of this project was to look at alternatives to address sea level rise and storm surge. Both of these roads are dead-end roads. So if they do overtop or they do flood, it creates a public safety issue because you can't get public safety vehicles out beyond the flooding. Also creates difficulty for any of you folks, if you live out beyond where the flooding happens and you can't get in and out to your residence or business. So we basically looked at options for trying to minimize or reduce the flooding, and in these two cases, the options that are available to us are looking at raising the road profile, so you raise the road up, get it out of the floodplain. There are also some temporary type options or portable options, portable seawalls that we can look at that could be deployed at the time of flooding or before the flooding happens that would provide some flood relief on these sections of roads. In other cases, we would be looking at other options as well. A little bit difficult to do here. There aren't a lot of opportunities for this, but we would often be looking at, are there opportunities for relocating the road and moving it out of the floodplain by relocating the road away from its current alignment. Think of Dingley Island Road. Obviously, that's pretty challenging to do because it's a causeway, and you would have to build another causeway to relocate it. So that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Lowell's Cove Road, there may be some options for relocating. It would obviously require land acquisition and working with property owners to try and find location and relocate that road. Typically, building a entirely new road is going to be a lot more costly than raising or modifying an existing road that's been in a location for a number of years. So we did not look at relocating Lowell's Cove Road as part of this. So we basically looked at raising the profile, and we've looked at these kind of temporary portable seawalls in both locations for this project. So we'll get into the details here. So Lowell's Cove Road, I'm going to jump ahead for a minute. This is the flood map. Has a pointer on. Okay. So there's essentially two locations on Lowell's Cove Road. When we started this project, we were looking at this location here. So here's Harpswell Islands Road here. Lowell's Cove Road comes down, 90-degree bend. I believe this is Lane Road here. And Lowell's Cove Road wraps around the head of the cove there. So this section of road actually does overtop, or did overtop in the January storms and has overtopped in other high tide events and storm events as well. There's a single small culvert that runs underneath the road right in here to a wetland on the other side. At our first meeting, there was a lot of discussion about whether we should be looking at this section of road or whether we should be looking at this section of road over here. And we ultimately, the decision was made to look at this section of road and not this one. And the reason being is that there are two access ways into these properties and these buildings down here. When it's not flooded, you can obviously come in both ways. There aren't any residences or structures right in here. There is one right at the corner here. So when it is flooded out in this location, you can access the residences and the structures on this side from Harpswell Island Road, or you can access these if they're not flooded out coming down Lane Road. So ultimately, we were directed to shift over here to this section of Lowell's Cove Road, which is a dead-end portion. This section of road's a little bit higher than this road here, so it doesn't necessarily flood out at the same time as this section of road. But I just wanted to give everybody kind of a heads up as to what section of Lowell's Cove that we're looking at. So it's right here at the head of the cove. And back up a slide here. So the existing road elevation at that location is around 10 feet. There's an existing 30-inch culvert that goes underneath the road that conveys some fresh water from the upland side. But when that tide comes up, that actually backfeeds that culvert and sends seawater back underneath the road into the wetland and the stream channel area on that side. That culvert does get submerged at high tide, so when you have a flood event or a king tide or a extreme high tide, it definitely is pushing water backwards through that culvert. FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, base flood elevation is elevation 13 feet at that, so essentially 3 feet over the low point of the road at that location. So here are the options that we looked at for this section of road. The first one, as I mentioned, is a portable flood barrier, and I'll have some pictures and show you what that looks like in a second. In addition to that barrier, though, we also are looking at installing what we call a check valve on that culvert. And basically, check valve would go on the end of the culvert, and it would prevent seawater from flowing backwards through that culvert. And that helps reduce the amount of flooding that happens on the backside of the road, if you will, by preventing that seawater from going back underneath the road and causing flooding due to that. These check valves, and there's a couple different kinds, I'll review those with you in a minute as well. And so that was the first option. The second option here is to basically raise the road up to the FEMA flood elevation of 13 feet. So basically raising it 3 feet above what it is today. So we'll review those options, and I'll provide some cost estimates as well in terms of what these options may cost. There's our flood map. You can see here, this is the flood elevation, elevation 13, and this is the approximate boundary of where that elevation 13 would flood if that were to occur. Tide gates. A couple different kinds of valves that can be used on culverts. This one here we call a tide flex valve. It's basically a rubber, I call it a duckbill. And basically what it does is it has this curved piece of rubber here at the end with an opening in it, a slit in it. What that does is when the water builds up a certain amount of head behind that, it basically pushes that slit open and allows the water to come out. But water coming back in this direction can't get through that slit. So this would be placed on the outlet end of that culvert at the head of the cove. Every time that tide comes up over the top of the pipe, this would prevent that water from flowing back through the culvert and causing flooding on the other side. Another type of valve or check valve is what we call a flap gate valve. You can see that there. Again, this would go on the outlet end of the culvert. As water builds up behind, it pushes the flap out and allows the water through. As water builds up on the outlet side, it basically forces that valve closed and, again, prevents water from flowing backwards through the culvert. Nice thing about this, relatively quiet. Not so nice thing about this is that water builds up behind this, opens up the valve, lets a slug of water through, and then the valve, the flap goes bang back against here, and it makes a lot of noise. So it's not a great solution in a kind of a residential environment because it is kind of a noisy contraption. This one's definitely more silent. This one costs a little bit more money, but in my opinion, this is a better option for providing backflow prevention. So portable flood barriers. There are a number of different types of these out there. We have looked at this option. It's actually, I believe, made over. They're made actually over in the Netherlands, but there are a number of suppliers that sell them in the United States. Basically, a freestanding barrier. This is one section that this guy is holding here in the picture. They basically interlock together. You basically line them up like a wall, and it essentially acts as like a seawall or a barrier to prevent water from going where you don't want it to go. Designed to sit, rest on relatively flat surfaces, so the edge of a road or a shoulder of a road is pretty convenient. Relatively lightweight. Obviously, downside is you've got to have someone that is willing and able to deploy these before the flooding event occurs.
And has a tractor.
Which can be a challenge, especially for a town that doesn't have a public works department, say, or something like that. So that is a downside. The biggest positive for these things is cost. They are much less expensive than raising a road and reconstructing a road. So we'll get into the costs here in a minute. But so this basically gives you a picture of how it works. So the flood water comes in on this side, and basically the pressure of that water is what holds this thing in place. They're interlocked, each piece is interlocked together, but the water pushing down on this leg of the L, if you will, holds that device in place. And it's kind of works on the same principle as like a guardrail you see along the edge of a road. So guardrail in its own right, if there were only like two posts and a guard in between, a rail in between those two posts, if you hit it, really wouldn't prevent you from going right through it with a vehicle. It acts as a system. So with all the posts, all the rail together, it basically, if you hit that, all those posts act together and keep you from going off the road if you don't go up over the top of it. But I mean, it basically, it works as a system. This works as a system as well. So if you have a big long length of this with the water pushing down on every single piece, it's going to stay in place. Whereas if you just had one piece sitting there, and a wave came in or something, you move it. But it acts as a system. So just a picture of how these things are stacked together, kind of like chairs almost. On Lowell's Cove Road, I need to put this up by my mouth here, or I'm going to get in trouble. We essentially need about 190 linear feet of this product to protect the road. And basically, they come in different sizes, but the one we would be looking at here is about a 40-inch high unit that would get us to that FEMA flood elevation, basically. So a little less than 200 feet. They come in crates. Obviously, if this was something that the town was interested in, you'd have to think about, okay, where do we store these things? Do we store them at some location next to the site? The ideal way to do it, or do we store them at some town facility, and then every time they need to get deployed, they have to get loaded onto a truck and hauled over to a specific location? So there's some logistics that need to be thought about if we were to proceed with something like this. But it's based on the cost, which we'll see next. I mean, it's kind of a nice solution when you compare it to what the road reconstruction costs are going to be. All right, so this is an aerial photo. Here we are, Lane Road here, Lowell's Cove Road going around, head of the cove. We've got our culvert, 30-inch culvert under the road right here. So this black dashed line here would be where we would need to install that deployable seawall if we were to deploy it. You're going to see when we get to Dingley Island Road that we're recommending deploying it on both sides of the road because you've got water coming in from both sides. But in this situation, if we put a check valve on this culvert, we think we can get away with just putting the deployable seawall on the ocean side of the road in this road here. So that's a positive. So option 2 looks at reconstructing Lowell's Cove Road and raising the road profile up to the FEMA flood elevation, which is elevation 13. So what we can see in this plan is up in the plan view, the darker gray area is the length of road that we would have to reconstruct. It's roughly about 260 feet or so of the road. So the elevation at this end and the elevation of this end is higher than the FEMA flood elevation. So that's how we chose how long a section that we need to reconstruct. Down here on the bottom is called a profile. Probably a little bit hard to see for everybody in the back, but the dashed line that you see comes in here, goes down. That's the elevation of the road, existing elevation of the road. And then you can see the culvert down here. The darker solid line is what the proposed elevation would be, which gets us up to a minimum of elevation 13, which is this orangish, yellowish line right in here. So you can see we basically touch that at the low point here. So that's, you've got a 3 feet, 4 feet of fill right here at the low point. All right, so we're going to get into some costs here. So option 1, portable flood barrier and tide gate. So we've basically got the products or the construction work up here. We've got the flood barrier. Looks like I might have a lower amount than I had mentioned on a previous slide. I'll have to fix that. But we've got the flood barrier, we've got the tide flex valve, we've got some miscellaneous costs in there for a total of around $97,000. We've got a contingency, which is 20% typical contingency that we apply to our cost estimates at the conceptual level. So we're up at $110,000. We've got estimated engineering and permitting, and then so project totals around $127,000 for the tide gate and the flood barrier. Versus option 2, for reconstructing 260 feet of road, we're about $700,000. So that's why I'm presenting you with the portable flood barrier as an option, just because the cost of these projects can get pretty significant. So, Marianne, you said we would hold the questions to the end. Do we want to do that, or do we want to do Lowell's Cove questions? Okay, because I think I'm moving on to Dingley Island after that. So I'm going to open it up to questions for you folks on Lowell's Cove. That works.
It's on.
Working. Hi, my name's Jess Sylvester. I've got a lot of experience with this area. Grew up there. My family's the owner of the property that fronts most of Lowell's Cove, or Flag Cove and Cynic Cove, which is those two bodies of water. That's what their real names are. Couple of questions. A couple of observations. The way that the overtopping of the road at the head of Flag Cove and the head of Cynic Cove typically happen is with, a continual run up of waves.
Surge, yep.
Exactly. I'm having a hard time seeing how those plastic barriers are going to be anchored enough so that they just don't get pushed out of the way. I understand the theory of it. If you've got standing water, the weight is going to be enough, but this comes infrequently and crashes. And it will crash, for 30 or 40 feet because waves don't come in parallel to the shoreline. So I'm just wondering if there's alternatives for anchoring those, along with whatever standing water. The water recedes each time with the succession of waves.
Good, good observation. Good point. There are other alternatives to these. There's a number of different alternatives out there for these kind of portable barriers. This is one that we picked out. One of the reasons we picked it was because it's relatively narrow, so it doesn't take up a whole lot of space on the road. But there are some other options that are anchored differently. Most of them do require that pressure from the standing water. So you've got a very good point there. So if you don't necessarily have that standing water on there, again, it acts as a system, but with the pressure of those waves, you may be right. That may not be a great alternative. So we would have to look at some other options maybe in terms of those portable type seawalls, see if we can come up with one that would work. I do know, having met with several of the manufacturers of these, that they do have testing that they've done with moving water. Have they done it in a storm situation with, these waves breaking and cresting right over the corner of the road? That's a good question. So we would have to probably dig into that a little bit more to fully answer that.
Another question is, do you have available the height that the January 10th and 13th storms achieved, or what somebody's claiming?
I'm not sure I have specific data at these locations in terms of what height that water got up to.
Yeah.
And I guess to throw that question back at you, I mean, I know it overtopped here. I'm assuming the waves overtopped here as well.
Yeah, it didn't. It's never overtopped that whole entire area that's shaded in either area.
Right. This one, the elevation of the road is quite a bit lower than this. So
Yeah,
this is elevation 10. This is more in the 8.5 range, I believe, somewhere in that vicinity.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think a lot of the flooding that happens at this location is caused by water that's backfeeding through the culvert at that location. So it actually starts flooding out back here a lot more quickly than it, before it overtops the road, I guess is what I'm saying. So
Yeah.
it kind of comes in from both sides, if you will. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Ben Skinner. I'm a resident of the neighborhood. Live on Highway 24 proper. But if you put a check valve on that culvert at Sinnett's Cove or Flag Cove, what aren't we concerned about the ramifications of that, like the side effects of preventing the wetlands from doing their job?
So these check valves, again, they work based on differential head. So yes, the head on the ocean side, I'll say the ocean side versus the upland side. As the ocean side comes up, water will build up on the upland side, but both these types of valves that I showed have a, I guess I'll call it a specification in terms of what the head difference is needed to force the water out through the valve from the upland side. So as that tide level comes up, the upland side's going to come up till it's just over the top of that, and then it's going to start pushing that water out through the valve. So it just takes a little bit of difference to force the water out through there. So yes, you will be creating some challenges in the back, but I mean, it's not ever going to be worse than just allowing the tide water to flow back up through that culvert. You're going to get more flooding that way than you would be with the differential between the head on either side of it. I'm not explaining that very well.
But I think I'm following you. I'm just concerned that we're preventing a wetland from doing its job. I mean, you're going to hold fresh water. These were rain events too, back to January. So the fresh water is going to be held where it is because the check valve's preventing seawater from coming up. I don't know.
But again, that differential in head, so the fresh water is going to get up just a little bit higher than the seawater, and then it's going to force its way out through the check valve.
Okay.
The water can go out through the check valve, it just can't come back
Yeah,
through.
I mean,
the
to
check
Jess Sylvester's point, the waves were it looked like the opening scene of Hawaii Five-0. And so,
It's
But
not
thank
going to
you.
prevent the waves from breaking over the top of the road. It won't prevent that.
yeah, but okay. I'll stand by for further education.
Yes.
We have a question in the chat. Will, can you explain the meaning of the current elevation of 10 feet and the FEMA elevation of 13 feet in terms of the likelihood of storm surge washing over this section of the road?
Wish I brought my full version of this map. I think it's the same, but so there's different designations of flood zones. And they're delineated by these white lines that you see on this plan. So zone AE is what I'll call a still water elevation. That's elevation 13. That's essentially on the road and back behind the road in both of these locations. On this side of this white line in both locations, it's a VE zone, which is a velocity zone or a surge zone. Don't think I should know it off the top of my head, and I apologize. I believe it's only a foot.
It's 14 feet.
Yeah, it's a foot higher than the AE zone in this case. In other places in town, it's significantly higher. We're working on a project over at the end of Ocean Street, for example, and the VE zone is significantly higher than the Stillwater. So it's a foot higher here, and that basically takes into account the storm surge, or the waves that come in. So I hope that answers the question.
I have a question. Did you consider a permanent seawall instead of raising the road?
We have not, and the main reason why is that they're extremely difficult to permit these days through the DEP and through the Army Corps. Not impossible, but it's a bear of a task to get a seawall permitted. If there's an existing seawall that you're repairing, then that's a little bit of a different beast. But to come in and say, we want to build a new seawall kind of all along that edge, it's, I hate to say, but it's going to take an act of Congress to get it approved. So.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
Or a comment. First of all, when they repaved Lowell's Cove Road, including the cove there, near Sue Baker's house, we were told that we had to wait for a while because they had to put a culvert in, and it had something to do with the culvert that you're mentioning that might have a whatever on it.
Check valve.
Check valve on it. And they told us it had to do with critters or fish or something like that we had to keep it open to, mention what Mr. Skinner said also. So that's what we were told when that road was repaved a few years ago. That had to be there and it had to protect sea creatures or something going back and forth. So I'm not sure what the valve will do whatever these sea creatures that we had to wait for a while to have that part of the road paved. The other thing is there's a puddle there. There's been a puddle there for years, and I feel like I've complained about it. The puddle is still there, but maybe if we raise the road or put in the barrier, maybe that huge puddle that I just drove, around tonight might disappear, because I think the road crew could drain that puddle because it just creates ice and puddles in the winter. Yeah.
At this
Where
location.
you'd have the barrier.
Yep.
Then my other question is with the red barrier. Couldn't you attach it to the metal that's there?
Guardrail?
to the guardrail? Could that hold it steady, what Mr. Sylvester was saying, that it might just push away?
Possible. It would be, it would increase the deployment time fairly substantially by doing that. But if it held it in place, that's a possibility.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, let's
Just,
do
yeah,
one more anyway.
quick question. On the Phil Sumner, local resident, on that diagram that you had the profile and the elevations of,
Yep.
could you just explain the red and black lines there? Maybe you mentioned it before, but thank you.
Yeah, so the red lines are DEP kind of permitting setback lines. So whenever you impact coastal wetlands, or any wetland for that matter, there are setback lines that you, so we just drew those on there they're really for permitting purposes, which we're not getting into right at the moment. But this one is a 25-foot setback off of the coastal wetland, which is the blue line that you see here. That's the highest astronomical tide line. So that's a 25-foot setback. There's a 75-foot setback is the second red line that we have there. And there's different permitting requirements for work that happens within each of those setbacks. So it's a permitting line. The black long lines that you see in here are proposed contour lines. So those relate to raising the road up. So it's just showing the impacts and how far out the grading is going to go when you raise that road up by 3 feet, 4 feet. Other lines that you see on here, approximate right-of-way is this double dash line that you see here, right-of-way. These are property lines. Those just came in from tax maps. And I think that covers most of the lines there. Down here, we've got several different elevations denoted. I described the proposed road profile. We have this purple line here is 3.9 feet of sea level rise, again, from the highest astronomical tide line, which is right down here at the top of the culvert. So the road actually, it's just below that 3.9 feet of sea level rise at the low point in here for about 35 feet or so. And yeah, I talked about the dashed line. So hope that answers your question.
I have a quick question. Steve Norman, Beckshore Lane. Has any consideration been given to, if this is done and the Lowell's, the part of the road that comes down from 24 is blocked, how are we going to get a fire truck around that corner? Having driven them, that's a pretty rough, even in a regular vehicle, that's a little hard.
This corner?
Are you going to take some of Sue Baker's land to make that corner a little bigger?
Yeah. Good question. We would likely need to do something in there. I'd have to look and do a turning movement diagram in there to see what a fire truck would do.
That's the way I would do it.
Typically, the fire department will find a way to get through if they need to get through, one way or the other. But it's a good question.
I've done it. I've driven that truck. So
Yep.
I know the problem.
Yep. All right.
I was just going to suggest that we move on to the Dingley Island and then go back to take questions after.
We will do that.
Thank you.
All right. Dingley Island Road. Thanks to some information I think that Mary Ann got for me, the Understand that the causeway was reconstructed in 2003, and that the Navy Seabees were involved with that reconstruction and the construction of the bridge or the opening through the causeway. So the options that we're looking at here, we've looked at a portable flood barrier as well. I have a similar comment as what you had on Lowell's Cove, in that I'm sure you get some wave action on both sides of that. But so portable flood barrier, in this case, we'd have one on both sides of the road. That would get us up, 40 feet above the existing road elevation. So the existing road elevation, minimum elevation is about 8 feet here. It's not 10 feet like Lowell's Cove, so it's a couple feet lower. FEMA-based flood elevation zone VE on one side is 13. On the other side, it's an AE zone elevation 10, I believe. We've looked at two different options for raising the road in this case. One is raising it 3.9 feet, which is an elevation that's listed in the Maine Won't Wait document. And then we've also looked at raising it to the FEMA flood elevation of elevation 13. So here we are, again, on the south side, the zone VE, elevation 13, basically, per the FEMA mapping, comes right up to the road. On the north side, it doesn't show on this map, but it's AE 10, I believe, coming in on the north side, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, common sense, when you think about it. It's 13 on one side and 10 on the other. Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but that's what the mapping shows. So again, similar to Lowell's Cove, this map here shows the extent of the portable flood barriers. If you were to install them or deploy them here and much longer in this case, so you've got the causeway here, but you also have some flooding or some low spot back in here that we would need to deal with as well. So they're quite a bit longer. The bridge or the opening through the causeway is basically right here in this case. Again, per your question, similar. We've got 25-foot setback, 75-foot setback, both sides. We've got right-of-way lines and contour lines as well on here. This is a picture that basically just shows a cross-section of the road with those portable barriers kind of on either side. Basically did this just to see what would fit in a given road. So we've got an 11-foot passageway in between, only one vehicle at a time, basically. These things are basically about 4 feet wide. So you've got about 19 feet of road out there at its narrowest. So this option here raises the road up to 3.9 feet of sea level rise. So again, the dashed line is, it looks a little bit distorted here. There's some jumps in there, but it's the profile is actually distorted in that the length and the height are distorted there, but so it looks a little bit worse than it actually does out when you drive across it. But essentially, you can see the dashed line down here, and you can see the proposed road profile here is the heavier dark line. FEMA flood line is way up here in this case. So it's not going to get you out of the floodplain. And this one, again, if we go back, you can see the contour lines that we've got here. So there's a lot of fill that would go in, riprap, basically, to raise that up. It's even more in this case where we're raising the road profile up to the FEMA flood elevation of 13. So there's a fair amount of impact here that would require permitting. All of these options would require permitting through the DEP and through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And the permitting for any of these options is going to be a lengthy process if the town decided to pursue any of them. So costs. This is the portable flood barrier up to 3.9. Again, relatively minimal cost, $120,000. We've got portable flood barrier up to the FEMA, more, 60. Then we start getting into the road here. So raising the road to 3.9 feet of sea level rise, you're looking at almost $2 million. $2 million. There's some significant costs associated with raising the overhead utilities here too. About that, because to maintain separation of the utility cables, so you got to raise those up as well, or you need to put them underground, which would even cost more money. And then the option to raise the FEMA up to the FEMA flood elevation is not quite another $1 million, but 2.7, $2.8 million to get that up to that elevation. So that's what I had to present to you folks. I don't think I'm doing a very good job of holding this up to my mouth while I'm talking, but
I have a question, Jane.
sure.
While I still remember what it is. Okay. Hi, I'm Celine Hale, and I'm at 113 Dingley Island Road.
Okay.
And that little camp, the one that's closest to the flooding. Can you go back? See where it's 123. No, the other side.
Okay, over in here.
That little hill, yeah. That's part of the property. My question is, if it's one way, and that's quite a bit of, quite a length, how do we know are we going to back up when how does that work?
Yeah, that is a challenge. If it was just in here, it would be a lot easier.
Right, you
but
can
with
see
it coming around the corner,
visually,
it's a valid point. The whole intent and the reason why I'm presenting the portable flood barrier is that, to me, it's really a stop. It's not intended to be a permanent solution. Mm-hmm. It's a stopgap solution that keeps emergency vehicle access to the dead end portion of the road. And it's not intended to be, everybody business as usual. So I don't have a good answer for you. It's not an ideal situation by any means, but it's not intended to be a permanent solution. It's intended to be a solution to allow emergency vehicles to get through this area that is potentially going to flood out and save someone's home, save someone's life, whatever. It's not intended to be the only solution, and it's a solution that's at what I would say a relatively reasonable cost when you consider the other alternative of fixing it permanently. I'm not saying you shouldn't fix it permanently, but there are challenges with coming up with the funding,
Right.
challenges with permitting, all of that stuff that goes along with that. These are big projects for towns like Harpswell or any town to take on. They're big infrastructure projects. So not a great answer for you, but it's really intended to be a kind of a stopgap.
Do they have to be red? We're green around here.
Don't know the answer to that. I think they come in red. That model comes in red.
Hi, I'm Tracy Sumner. I'm also on Lowell's Cove over on the other side. But the question I have pertains to both of these, to the temporary barriers, and that is, would they be deployed immediately before a surge and left up for a day or two, or would they be deployed in October and left up until March?
No, the intent would not be to deploy them in anticipation of some event that is not, we don't know if it's going to happen. The intent would be, there's a weather forecast that's predicting an event, to deploy them as close to that event as you can, but we're also realizing that you've got to have the people power to put them out there and deploy these things, and potentially at multiple locations. So we presented this as an option on Abner Point Road as well. If you don't have enough people to actually deploy it, it takes a lot of manpower to put those out there.
Yeah, especially 12 crates.
What's that?
Especially 12 crates.
Oh, just how much manpower? How long would it take to set these up?
So for
And
this,
how many men?
For
or
this
women?
length, based on, again, what the manufacturers are telling us, it would take a team of 2 to 3 people a couple hours to put them out.
Really?
But it depends, if you've got one person that's going out there to put them out, it's going to take a little bit longer, obviously. If you've got multiple sites to put them out at, it's just a matter of, the town doesn't have a full staff of public works employees to go do this. So is there a citizen group that says, hey, we'll volunteer and we'll be the deployers of, Dingley Island Road, and another group is the deployers of, Abner Point Road, and another group is the deployers at Lowell's Cove Road, or, I don't know, there's so many infinite possibilities of how that could work. It's, again, is it a perfect ideal solution? I'm not saying that it is. I'm just presenting it as an alternative that would, again, be kind of a stopgap that would potentially save lives, be a public safety improvement, because we can't afford to spend $2 million, $3 million, whatever it is, to rebuild the road to what we want it to be.
Hi, Agnes Torshire. I live around the corner of Spruce Cove. I'm just curious, there were 12 crates estimated for this and 2 for the other location. Where would they be? And when we're talking a couple of guys, a couple of hours, you're hauling 12 crates from some location.
Very good question. Do you build does the town acquire a piece of property here to build a storage shed in to hold the,
Don't look at me.
hold these things?
I mean, it's just the logistics
Or
of.
it's a logistic issue. And again, I mean, it's, how many of these do we do? I mean, we've now looked at 5 different roads here. These 2, Abner Point, Bethel Point, Basin Point. If the town says, oh, we want to buy portable flood barriers for each one of these roads, okay, then you've got to figure out who's going to deploy them, where is each one going to be stored, how are we going to pick the right one that goes over to Basin Point Road versus the one that's going to Lowell's Cove? So there's a lot of logistics there that I haven't figured out at this point in time. But-
What was the rationale for having it on both sides here?
Well, you've basically got water body on both sides with water, flood water coming in from both sides.
It's a reverse tide there. So it
Yeah.
floods to one side and then floods to the other.
Right.
And
We did the same thing on Abner Point Road.
it did come in from both sides last January.
Yeah.
Okay, excuse me. Have these been tested or along the coast of Maine, someplace in similar circumstances? I'm just sure what's the reliability of their
Yeah.
efficacy?
So again, there are a number of different manufacturers and models out there. We presented a model at Abner Point Road public meeting that was a little bit different than this, that the town of Damascotta has purchased for their big parking lot there, right on the ocean front, right on the, right in behind the Main Street there. So my understanding is they've purchased a version that's more of a, we call it a flexible version of this. It's not this model. And they haven't had to use it yet. So, but they've been tested in numerous situations. That model that Damascotta purchased is manufactured up in Canada, and they have used it, and they have multiple locations in the United States as well that it's been used successfully. A lot of people use them just to protect their homes, so they'll actually buy these things and just basically wrap them around their home and keep flood water from coming into their basement or their first floor. But they are used in coastal situations, they're used in river situations, multiple situations, and they've also been tested at universities and, hydraulically with moving water, with still water, with logs and rocks being chucked at them, and all kinds of different things. So there's all kinds of testing. That, again, there's websites for most of these products. I think this presentation has been posted to the town's website. If you want to look at the so this NOAQ, N-O-A-Q, box wall flood barrier, if you want to type that into Google or whatever search browser you use, I mean, you'll pop right up with their website with information about these systems, this system in particular.
Is it actually functioning as like a dam?
Yeah.
So sorry, for the people at home. So if you could just go back to the Dingley Island Road, maybe this is a very silly question. So if you have it on the south side and you've essentially erected a dam so it can't go through to the north side, doesn't that just force the water to spill over east and west and just flood?
Well, that's why we've got it as long as we have, because
Right.
we've brought it out to the elevation that
Right.
flood water would not go around it. If we only put it in here,
Right.
then yes, that, once it got up to whatever elevation it is at the end of that barrier, then it would wrap around the edges.
Got it. Okay.
When you showed the placement of the riprap to meet the FEMA 13-foot specification, that one, right, in the black areas where the riprap would extend to, does the velocity of the water through the culvert increase with a longer span?
I would say no. We would be keeping the, longer length. So span.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'd be keeping the span the same. So the length of that wouldn't increase the
Okay.
velocity. If we were narrowing the span, we would, or reducing the height of it. But in this case, we're actually increasing the height of
the culvert?
the culvert and keeping the span the same, so the velocity should not
Okay.
increase.
Okay, before we wind up, we have one more question from the chat, and it goes back to the earlier question regarding the elevations. And it was really to get at how vulnerable we think this section of the road is at storm surge. Now, we're talking back at Lowell's Cove Road and the option that we were presenting, given that it did not experience a washover in the January storms. So I would take this to mean that in the last January and last year's storms, where we had the very, very high 14-foot storm surge, that part of Lowell's Cove Road did not top over. And I'm looking at the people who live on that road. Yeah, right. It did not. Okay. So we had, it sounds as though we have a little more time there.
Well, and as I said, the elevation of this section of Lowell's Cove Road is actually high. It's out of all the roads that we've looked at, the existing elevation of the road, the low point of the road here is actually higher than all of the other roads that we've looked at to date. So elevation 10, we're typically at elevation 8 to 8.5, maybe 9 on the other roads that we've looked at, whether it's Bethel Point Road, Abner Point Road, Dingley Island Road, and I don't remember Basin Point exactly, but that's pretty low too. So.
Marion, when Amber and I saw you, oh, thank you. Ben Skinner again. Marion and my wife Amber and I chatted with Marion as the storm was just receding, and there were about 12 or 13 inches of water that I remember at the road by Flag Cove, the one to the west. And,
That's much lower.
And right,
Yeah,
just for the record.
Yeah.
And then the waves were crashing over in addition.
There was some pretty good rocks that got moved around over there.
Yep. And Jess and his brother were moving them, and we were, it was kind of a thing.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. And again, I think that elevation of the existing road there is more in that 8 range.
That's what we remember from last.
Plus or minus.
I was just going to say thank you for presenting the options of a couple of different solutions. Thank you. That was good.
Thank you.
I think we've answered most of the questions. I just want to go back a little bit and kind of do an overview to be thinking. These are planning situations, and we're planning for the future. The idea of having this information is for the town to be able to plan as we start to have more and more storms, and this happens more frequently. The town needs to be in a position to figure out, we have like 5 town roads that get affected. And the town has to be able to think about how they're going to react to this in the future and how to plan financially for that. So, but the other great thing is, I think, is you have brought up some less expansive options that we can start to employ or deploy if this becomes more frequent, and you've got 4 or 5 roads that are flooding over very frequently for a short period of time. The other thing, these are normally storm surge, so you might be flooded for an hour or 2, and then they drain back out. It's not where other areas you flood and you've got it there for days. So those are all things to think about, I think, as we talk more about it. Also, we have submitted another grant request to do a modeling of Harpswell with storm surge. Something to understand about the flood elevations from FEMA. They're based on history, but So it's basically looking at, and correct me if I'm wrong, because it's looking at what had happened before and how has happened. We're finding that we're getting more flooding in areas that it hadn't happened before more frequently. We'd like to know in town, we'd like to model the town to give people an idea on all roads and all parts of town how they can plan better. We don't know if we'll get the grant or not. We'll find out in a few months. But again, these are all an attempt to put the town and the townspeople in a better position as we have more and more storms, and think about ways how we're going to be able to pay for it, basically. So thank you for being interested. And if you have any further questions, always glad to take them. You can just email conservation at Harpswell Town on the Harpswell website. I can never remember it. It's a tough one. Conservation. Harpswell Town no, it's okay.
One other quick thing that I'll add on the check valves. Someone brought up the question of kind of the Lowell's Cove Road, and you actually do have a stream coming in on the backside of the road there. You mentioned, I think it was a woman over here mentioned something about the wildlife passage through there. Very good question, and again, likely would be a permitting issue. One of the other roads, not that we talked about tonight, but Abner Point Road has a culvert right by the boat launch there that goes under the road, and it just collects drainage from a ditch on the other side of the road. And that, when the tide comes up, that tide backfills that ditch and floods out the property right next to the, whatever the name of the
Luby Drive.
Lane.
Yep.
Floods out the property right next to Luby Lane. It's not a stream, so there's less of a concern about the environmental impacts of that. So that's a ideal location for the town to, if they wanted to help out a little bit. It's not going to solve the flooding problem, but they could put a tide flex valve or a check valve on that culvert, and it would help out the property owners on the other side of the road a fair amount right off the bat. And it would be a very minimal permitting issue there. Putting a check valve on the culvert at Lowell's Cove, there is going to be some permitting that needs to happen to do that. And again, primarily because of the issue of, critter passage in underneath there. That culvert's long enough that I would be willing to bet that you're not going to get a lot of critter passage through that culvert because they don't like going into those. I mean, other than porcupines, which love to live in the culvert underneath my driveway, but I don't think they're going to be going through a tidal culvert. Anyway, just another thought on the check valve. Those would be relatively easy and low-cost things to do on a relatively short time frame if the town was interested in spending some money on that type of stuff.
Which remind me of something else. The town has a capital road budget and plan where they do major road repairs every 10 or 15 years. Ideally, once we have this information in place, when the question comes up to redo Lowell's Cove Road, it will be revisited again to see if it is cost effective to do it now. This came up on Basin Point Road. That project was done in 2016 or 18. And when they resurfaced there, we looked at the project to see if it was cost effective to think about raising the road at that point. Turned out that we were told by the engineers that we would probably get 15 years use before the road would have to be done again. And looking at where we are, we could wait until then to do the additional. And these are going to be questions that are going to come up all along the line. And I go back to saying at least we'll have information, and then the determination of funding it and how it's going to be paid for can be made with good information. So thank you again for coming tonight.